So I get the honor of introducing our brother John Knox, and he has become a dear friend of mine. In fact, as he moved into the new role that he's at here at SIBI, we share a wall now, and so his office is right next to mine. It's been a blessing to get to know him. I'm just going to read over his bio really quickly to give you an introduction of this great man, and you're in for a treat here in just a moment. John Knox serves as Dean of Ministry Training for SIBI. He earned his BA degree in speech communications from Lubbock Christian University. He additionally holds master's degrees in biblical and related studies in clinical mental health counseling. His Doctor of Ministry degree focused on crisis ministry. Before joining the faculty at SIBI in 2024, he served churches in ministry roles for 37 years. He has a special interest in crisis ministry, serving as law enforcement chaplain for 34 years. He's got some great stories. I hope he shares some of those with you today. He is currently serving on the crisis team for the Lubbock Police Department. And John and his wife, Jan, have been married for 40 years, and they have 3 adult sons and 2 grandsons, and a granddaughter on the way. So let me invite John up here to preach, teach what he's going to, and especially bring the word into this.
All right.
Thank you, brother.
David. Well, an update since that was written, we have a granddaughter due in April. We have a grandson due in August.
All right.
So our oldest and our youngest are expecting my youngest. I'm so excited about him paying for his racing. I just know that little girl's going to be just like him, and I can't wait. So let's jump right in and talk about some things that are really important. I don't know about y'all. My heart's in D.C. right now. Just watching everything last night, I had a hard time sleeping. I have been on recovery missions with first responders of that nature, never on that scale, but when we have been when there's multiple fatalities, that is an unbelievable experience. It's stressful and somber at a level that I can't not possibly put in words. So as David mentioned, 34 years now, this month, 35 years in law enforcement chaplaincy. I'm currently serving very part-time on the victim services crisis team at the Lubbock Police Department. I live 1 or 2 shifts. I work night shifts, go in at 6 in the evening, get off at 2:30 in the morning. And that's a stretch for an old guy. They partnered me up with the youngest person on the team, and I'm officially the oldest person on the team. So we got the youngest and the oldest partnered up and working together. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment. So as you serve in ministry, whether you're serving as a preacher or an elder or just a member of the congregation, you want to serve and do things in meaningful ways. Here's some of the ministry needs you expect. And especially for those of you that are serving as preachers, you expect, as you serve a congregation, there is going to be illness among church members. And there's going to be death. You're going to officiate at some funerals. And you want to minister well to homebound members, especially elderly people who are homebound and due to illness can't get out very much. Discouraged members, that's a ministry in of itself. And you want to encourage, if it's a great core of volunteers, you want to encourage them and encourage them well. And obviously you want to do outreach and do outreach well. Those are all the things you expect. And I'm going to talk about none of those things today. I'm going to talk about all the things that you don't expect and that you certainly didn't anticipate as you got involved in ministry or even as you are serving the congregation. So what I'm going to do today is just basically go over 7 principles of responding to a crisis. Now, here's where I'm going to really try to stick to the script and have some good solid principles. I remember going to a chaplaincy training that the police department paid for me to go, and it was fairly expensive. And one of the presenters, all he did was tell war stories. And I thought, I've been there, I've heard this. I want something really solid that I can take away. But I find myself tempted to do that. I've had so much experience that it's tempting to tell these things that are really interesting and compelling. And I will tell one, and I will say it's a story worth telling, and it involves a chocolate cake. So I'll do that at the very end. So I'll just kind of leave that little carrot dangling there, or leave that chocolate cake dangling. We're all going to want to go find us a chocolate bun cake now somewhere. So here we go. So I did a little inventory. I served the church in Granbury, Texas, right outside of Fort Worth, as a preaching minister for 20 years prior to coming on here at SIBI full-time. I grew up here in Lubbock and terrorized the streets of Lubbock. So I owe the police department, I really do, because I didn't grow up in the church, and my friends and I, as students at Monterey High School, we terrorized the streets of Lubbock. So we caused crisis. We didn't respond to crisis, we caused crisis. But I did an inventory in 2023, this is in Granbury, I thought I'm going to do an inventory. What kind of crisis events did I respond to in a calendar year? This is a church. We averaged about 600 people on a Sunday morning. So I had a church member arrested, at least one. There may have been more than one, but I recall one in particular. I had an individual with immigration issues. Not somebody that was here illegally, somebody that was here in the country legally. Someone told her 8th grade son, if you'll go to that church that has the red brick over there across the street from the high school, they'll help you. That was our congregation. And so his mom and son showed up. Her English was very limited. My Spanish is very limited, but we muddled through somehow and baptized her, baptized her son. And it was really exciting. But yet she had some language barriers and some things related to immigration as far as getting a job, and we were able to help with that. So that was a crisis. We really needed to help her as a new Christian. I had a teen that approached me who was struggling with it. He believed in God. And I said, well, why don't you come by Tuesday afternoon after school? It's just right across the street. And that Tuesday afternoon after school turned into 2 years every Tuesday after school. Every Tuesday we met for 2 solid school years, and it was a blast. I had a great time. I learned more from him than he learned from me. Emotional difficulties and mental illness. You have no idea. Yeah, you do. You do know. It's pronounced and it's growing in that area. Broken families, registered sex offenders. Dealing with an aging population, here's what's shifting. I've really noticed this in my work in law enforcement. An aging population where they don't have family or even people close to them to help with their care. So you have this alarm. The boomers are aging. And I have to confess, I is one. I am a boomer. And we boomers are aging. But we don't have the family resources that generations prior to us did. And that's creating a real challenge for the church in terms of a crisis event. Okay, not only deaths, you expect deaths, but you don't expect those terrible, tragic, unexpected deaths. Moral failures, and then I would put in and because your wheels are turning. And you could fill in the and with a lot of crisis events that you have dealt with in your particular congregational setting. So you get the call. You are familiar with the call, aren't you? And those don't always come at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, do they? Sometimes they come at 3 o'clock in the morning. So you get the call. And so I'm going to start out very basic and get more and more specific as we go on. So the call. The first question to ask is, what is my responsibility in this situation? Because you can't do everything. You can put on your cape and think you're Superman if you want to. But I used to tell young chaplains when I was doing training for law enforcement chaplains, let those guys who drive the red fire trucks do the rescuing. And I scrapped that. I don't say that anymore. Now I say, let God do the rescuing. He has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. Amen. Let him do the rescuing. We're not rescuers. We are simply servants. We are instruments of righteousness. So with that in mind, what kind of instrument can I be? What has God equipped me uniquely to do in this situation? You've got to ask yourself that question maybe in a split second. Because after all, you got the call. And so you can't swoop down and do everything. But what can you do? So on that note, to take it to the next level, then how can others assist and respond as well? You have elders or you have people in your congregation who are uniquely suited to do particular things. I think this is a truth. A solo response is seldom a good response. Okay, I'm of a mind to go Lone Ranger. Working on the crisis team here, I love having a partner. We go in partners. Everything we do in partners. And I love having partners because they bring strengths that I don't have. Some of my partners are bilingual, and that's really an asset here in Lubbock. So a solo response is seldom a good one. And before you make promises, think. What boundaries need to be put in place? Don't think about that later, because that's typically what we do. We get ourselves in some kind of mess, and we've painted ourselves in a corner, and we've gotten overwhelmed. And you think, I probably should have put some boundaries in place. So think about boundaries ahead of time. What about timing? So you can't solve everything at 3 o'clock in the morning. I had a professor when I was in school for theories of counseling, and he said that a lady called him at 1 o'clock in the morning very distraught. Her husband was very angry. He took a bowling ball and threw it through the television set. And she said, Dr. Faulkner, would you come over and help us? And he said, he looked at us, and this is Paul Faulkner, who's deceased now, and some of y'all will remember him. And he said, I told her to come at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at my office. And I thought, that story has always stayed with me. That's been over 40 years ago, but it's still stayed with me. So what about timing? What can you do right now, and what can occur later? Not everything has to be addressed at this very moment. And if this is something that impacts the church, what can be communicated to the church? So, for example, one Memorial Day weekend, late on Friday afternoon, I had my whole family with me. And we're looking forward to a little long weekend, a preacher's long weekend, where you have Friday, Saturday, you preach on Sunday, then you resume on Monday. You know what a preacher's holiday weekend looks like. One of my elders called 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, and his 45-year-old wife had taken her own life. Okay, this is an elder's wife. My children had been swimming at their home. She was always very kind to my kids. My kids were little then. So not only do I have to think about how am I going to minister to this elder and his family of 4 boys, but what at this juncture can I communicate to the church, and what's confidential? That we'll get into confidentiality in a little more detail here in just a moment. And obviously it's important to consider the needs of your family. So what's high priority, what's not? I remember getting called out on a death in the ER of a church member on Christmas Eve as we were opening Christmas presents. But that's a death. I went. Now, had it been something other than that, I would have said, we're opening Christmas presents. My family's going to take precedent. People don't die at convenient times. That's just a reality of life. So what have I learned from serving in law enforcement context? 30, 45 years, you learned something, you would hope. Other than all of us, none of us that work in that field, none of us are well individuals. I probably should go on and tell that. If you work in that field, you're not a well individual. Safety first. Okay, if an officer was down here, that's the first thing that comes out of their mouth. Safety, your safety. Your safety comes first, and the person that you're serving, then their safety. Your safety always first. Always, always, always. And in church settings, there are situations where you have to ask that question. If you're dealing with someone where there's potential for domestic violence, for example, and that's not uncommon, you've got to ask, what does safety look like? And as I've already emphasized, the value of partnerships, going with someone, and the value of networking. So I know this person over here who has experience here, this person over here is a social worker, and they can help us do some network, and this person over here is a licensed professional counselor that goes to church with us. The importance of confidentiality and knowing when to break it. Y'all know the 2 main issues for breaking confidentiality. The first one is any form of child abuse at all, particularly if there's an outcry of sexual abuse of a child. You absolutely, positively, no exceptions, have to report that either to Child Protective Services in the state of Texas or to law enforcement. My preference would be to go to law enforcement first because they're going to get involved anyhow. So I generally bypass CPS and go directly to law enforcement on a situation like that. And it's happened, and it will happen. Or any form of child abuse. The second one is suicide ideation. So if you have any inkling that a person is a threat to themselves, or it's not real common, they are a threat to someone else. Those are the main ones on breaking confidentiality. There's others, but those are the 2 main ones. And then the value of crisis communication principles, and we're going to really stress active listening this morning. I'm going to try to get done in enough time we can have some time for questions before we finish. So here's the first principle, is active listening. So I did when I was in Granbury, I served on the hostage and crisis negotiation team. I'm not serving on Lubbock's team. I'm simply doing a little consulting with them, which consulting means when they need a bad guy, they want me to come and role play with them, be the bad guy. I did that a couple of Fridays ago, and the lieutenant and the supervisor looked at me and said, "You're doing that way too well. It's quite disturbing." And I said, "Well, it comes from 35 years of doing this kind of work." But when I did my basic negotiation training in Austin several years ago, this was the training we got. We got trained on active listening. And I remember thinking, I have a counseling degree. I've done this. So this is going to be a breeze. Wow, it was humbling. When we actually did role plays, it was very, very humbling. So here, paraphrasing and reflecting feelings, these are all important things. Effective pauses, but I put in parentheses. In crisis ministry, it's so very important to feel comfortable with silence. Mm-hmm. And that's something, as my family will be quick to tell you, I love to talk. And I enjoy being I enjoy humor. I enjoy all those things. But I've learned in a crisis setting over the years, I've learned how to shut my mouth, and I'm very, very comfortable with silence. And that's so important. I can't stress that enough. Ministry of presence. But what I want to accentuate this morning is just asking some open-ended questions. So here's just for a quick practice. You have a church member that comes to you and says, my wife has been seriously ill. Apparently the church doesn't care. And it's said just in that tone. And what are you tempted to do? Oh, Brother Jones, the church does care. This is a very loving church. And we have this ministry that ministers to people who are seriously ill, and off you go. And which all that's going to do to Brother Jones is pour gasoline on his anger. And he's going to walk away. Now, he was mad when he came to you. Now he's even more angry. So asking Brother Jones some open-ended questions. Oh, first it would need to begin with an apology. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we've obviously dropped the ball. Whether you have or not, it doesn't hurt to apologize. Tell me more about what's going on with your wife. Obviously, we don't know. What can you tell me? And start asking, exploring, because as we're going to come back to this case study here in just a minute, there is a distinct possibility there's more going on with Brother Jones than him just being upset about someone not come see his wife. There's more to that story. The presenting story is seldom the real story. It took me a long time in ministry to figure that out. You know, people come complain to you about the color of the carpet in the auditorium. It's not about carpet. It's not about carpet. It's about something else. And even with someone whose wife is seriously ill, that may not be the only issue. Our daughter has never felt like she fit in the youth group at church. And again, you're tempted to say, yeah, but we've got the best kids on planet Earth, and why would she not fit in, and la, la, la. Scrap that. Well, what's been going on with your daughter? Can you tell me a little more about her experiences with the other students? I'd like to know more about that. And then take the time to listen. Or my son was arrested this week. Please don't tell anybody at church. They're telling you something really significant. They're a little bit ashamed maybe, but what they're really telling you is, I don't think church is a safe place. Wouldn't you say? That's what they're telling you. That I want anybody to know. Shouldn't we support each other no matter what's going on? You know, my three boys, the little angels, they're preachers' kids. My youngest was at Oklahoma Christian as a freshman and got in trouble, and he was with three other preachers' kids. You put four preachers' kids together, you got trouble. You got trouble. And my first reaction was, I don't want to tell anybody about this, but I went and told my elders, and the elder went to confide, and he said, well, let me tell you about my son when he was in college. He told me this, and I'm like, I felt better. I said, oh, okay. I felt a lot better. Someone comes to you and said, church is not doing anything right. I dread even coming on Sunday. Does that make you feel a little defensive? My coworker at Wichita Falls, when I was a campus minister, I just happened to be in the foyer standing next to him when a lady came up to him after church service and said, brother, I've heard good preaching and I've heard bad preaching, but you're the worst. We later found out that she has some dementia going on, but poor Larry, we told him she was just fine when she told us that. But aren't you tempted to get defensive? But don't get defensive. Well, we're not doing right. Tell us what we're doing wrong. Just tell us. And people tend to calm down once you start asking. So that's why I really wanted to accentuate open-ended questions and the value of open-ended questions. Here's principle 2, which is where we've just alluded to a moment ago, and that is the presenting story the real story? So if we're willing to practice the discipline of continuing to listen, one of my coworkers is an expert on listening skills, one of my former coworkers, he's retired now. And Chris said, if we will continue to listen, the real story will eventually come to the surface. And I've found that to be true over and over. Just continue to listen, continue to be quiet, don't interrupt. That there goes back to that gravitating towards being really comfortable with silence. Secondly, being the non-anxious presence. I'm going to teach a short course here at SIBI on conflict resolution in March. And one of the things we're really going to stress is no matter how upset that person is, no matter what they say to you or how they say it, you remain non-anxious. My philosophy, especially doing work with people on the streets, as their tone goes up and becomes more belligerent, and as they talk louder, my tone gets softer and I talk softer. 90% of the time it works. Just get softer and softer. I tell people, I've been called everything a human being can possibly be called, and then some you've never heard of. And you can't let that rattle you. I had a guy in a fatality crash. His wife was killed. I mean, I had never been cussed like that before. Long story short, I ended up officiating at his wife's funeral. And he came back to see me at my office on several occasions, and now, we laughed about that experience. He still felt bad about it. And I'm like, we don't worry about those things. You just remain non-anxious. And verbally, when it's time to speak, express empathy. Not necessarily, I know how you feel. Do people appreciate that? If you haven't been in that situation, saying, I know how you feel, probably not a good idea, but express empathy saying, I really feel for you. I feel for what's going on. I'm listening. I feel for you. And do whatever you can to find rapport. In negotiation training, we call that a hook. Find a hook. That there is some common ground. There's something for rapport. And apologize when appropriate. Does the church fail? Do we fail ministering to people? Sure we do. We're flawed human beings. And so we dropped the ball. We failed to come see you when your wife had surgery. We failed to really follow up well when you had a death in your family, or whatever it is that someone is really upset about. Just apologize sincerely. And then you have the privilege of influencing behavior. So same case studies, continuing to listen, not getting rattled, expressing empathy. My son's been arrested. I really feel for you. I know that's got to be really, really tough. And I can't imagine what you're experiencing right now. However, whatever you can do to establish rapport. Just like when I went to that elder and told about my son, he told me about his own son, who's now a very successful professional. And what he did when he was in college, he expressed empathy, and it created rapport between the two of us. And, we got a good chuckle out of it, that our kids aren't flawless. And here's principle 3, confronting sin. Same principles. Okay, needs to be a confrontation. How many of y'all in here enjoy confrontation? Anybody enjoy confrontation? What I'm going to, in the conflict class, one of the things I'm going to stress is everybody falls on a conflict continuum. And there's people far on one side who would avoid conflict at all costs, or conflict avoiders. And I tell them, if they thought they could go from here to Legoland via Beijing, if they could avoid conflict, because people, they're conflict avoiders. And the other side of the extreme are those people who enjoy getting up in somebody's face. They're rare, but they're around. Have you ever met one of those? I've met one or two that thrive on conflict. And then everybody falls somewhere in that continuum. So in confronting sin, same thing, non-anxious presence, active listening, and the scripture accentuates the importance of restoring gently, does it not? Those of us who are spiritual should restore that person gently. So a gentle confrontation, loving exhortation, and yet you've got to be direct enough in such a crisis to relay, here's the consequences. So I've got 2 examples. One would be dealing with registered sex offenders. Everybody had that opportunity in church. I've had that opportunity on several occasions. We had in Granbury some years back a man who had been convicted in another county, went to prison, got out, was not paroled. He was out scot-free, but would have to register for the rest of his life. So we sat down with him and we said, he wanted to come to church with his parents who were elderly. And we said, we don't want you to not come to church, but there's definitely going to be some parameters. And here are the parameters. You're always going to be accompanied by someone that we designate. We have a couple of men that are willing to be your escort, who, when you come to the front door, they're going to accompany you from the time you get there until the time you leave. There are certain parts of the building, for example, the way our building was designed, everything that went on with teenagers and children there was kind of a magic dividing line. So the way it was designed, you could say that here's a magic dividing line, and that you'll never be in that part of the building. That was another consequence. There were several other things, but those were the two main things. Always be accompanied, would never be, and even if we had an all-church fellowship, he was uninvited because there'd be children present. And we felt like that the safety of children took precedent. That was the protecting children. That goes back to that safety first. So safety first, I probably should rewrite that and say safety of children first. Or we could even say the safety of the most vulnerable among us, which would include people who are elderly or people with special needs. Whoever could be classified as the most vulnerable among us, we have a profound responsibility to protect them. And so we relayed the consequences, and he complied with everything. Unfortunately, he did reoffend, not in a church situation, but he did reoffend, and he is in prison now, and he will be until the rest of his life. So that was, I don't think we failed. I look back on that, and I think we did everything we should have done. We gave him every opportunity to experience redemption. What he did outside of those parameters, we had no control over at all. Here's a second one. I had a couple of these the last few years. A volunteer who will not follow the rules. Okay, so maybe that's a big deal, maybe it's not. But this particular one I'm thinking of is a volunteer who refused to comply with rules in serving children. So we had a ministry where, again, as I told you, the high school was right across the street from our building. The middle school was about a block away, so it's walking distance. So we had a great program on Wednesdays. Students get out of school at 4:15 or 4:30. They could walk to our building on Wednesday, play basketball. We had tutors to help them with homework. We served a meal. We had class for the middle school and high school students at night. It was great. We had students that were coming from all kinds of backgrounds. It was not easy. I mean, it was really a challenging ministry, but it was really meaningful. And we had a volunteer that would, we said, if you're going to take kids home in the church van, there's going to be 2 volunteers. It's going to be 1 male and 1 female. That was our policy. And he failed to comply with the policy. And when we confronted him about it, he just kind of laughed it off. And my response was, I'm going to make you think laugh off. I don't see the humor in that at all. And so I'll cut to the chase and just say we ended up having a gentle confrontation with loving exhortation. I feel like I was a part of that. We had some elders who were a part of that. And I feel like we handled it well. Now, on his part, it was explosive. He felt like we were self-righteous and that we were being ridiculous. His adult son, came with him and told him how awful we were, that we weren't real Christians, on and on and on. But I told the elders before we met, I don't care what they say to us, we're going to be steady in the boat. And we're not going to get rattled. And we're not going to respond to that kind of thing. We'll listen and we'll be kind, but we're going to stick to what we've decided and steer that through. Follow up to that story, about a year later, an investigator in Hood County, we had 3 investigators who exclusively investigate sexual crimes against children. It's a task force in the DA's office. And one of those investigators, I know her well, she called and she said, hey, do you know so-and-so? I think he goes to your church. It's this guy. And I said, yeah, used to. He doesn't anymore. She said, we're investigating him. How can you help me? We're investigating him. We think he's probably good for some sexual assaults against children, but we're trying to gather information. And so I told her the story about how we handled it. And to our knowledge, nothing happened under our watch. We don't think so. We hope not. We think that we kept tight enough reins. But as it turned out, she said they couldn't get anybody to say anything negative about him. He was kind of a guy that would help people pay their rent and buy groceries for him and things like that. So consequently, Nobody said anything negative. She said, we know he's good for it, but we can't get enough to indict him. So that was a follow-up to that. But those are the kind of things that's where I'm thinking about confronting sin. I'm thinking about these are sinful choices that impact the whole church, and especially potentially victimized children. And just as an aside to that, I'll say, if you're working with children, background checks are great. Run background checks. They're a good thing, but they don't accomplish much. The best thing you can do is pay attention, because a lot of offenders have a squeaky clean background check, but that doesn't mean they're squeaky clean. So be alert, pay attention. If something, I call it the uh-oh feeling, and my wife tells me I'm way too suspicious. She said, you're a little jaded. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just cautious. She said, no, you're jaded. But you need people who are paying attention and thinking, that doesn't look right to me. That doesn't feel right. I have a bad gut feeling about it. If you're getting a bad gut feeling, I think that's coming from somewhere. I think God works in multiple ways. Amen. You've had bad feeling. It's an uh-oh feeling, and God gives us uh-oh feelings for a reason. If you have an uh-oh feeling, just follow up on it. So why do I have that uh-oh feeling? Why do I not feel good about that? So this is another negotiation principle. It's called go to the balcony. And I think it's so good. That's why I wanted to apply it here. It's such a great principle. Going to the balcony means step back, assess the situation, and develop an objective view. In other words, walk up to the balcony and visualize in your mind, okay, here's this conflict situation or this crisis event that we're dealing with in church. And so how can what can I do in an objective way? So in a crisis, it's tempting to get so wrapped up in it and get all emotional, and you lose your ability to be objective. So in your mind, go to the balcony, climb the stairs, get you a good seat, and look at the stage where the drama is unfolding. Get off the stage where the drama is. Stop being an actor and step back and be an observer on the balcony. And suspend your reaction. Just, let your blood pressure come down and take a little time to reflect and use that part of your brain that's not emotional, almost detach just a little bit to let the logical part of your brain function. And ask yourself, what's the goal here? What are we trying to do? Because when you get in a crisis, you start spinning. And everybody's emotional, and everybody's emotions are running high. And so just stop, what is the goal here? What are we trying to do? Oh, we're trying to help this family that's had an unexpected death. But we've gotten so caught up in all the emotion driving it. And let's just say, I'm going to use the example, pick on preachers. Preachers easy to pick on. So solicit some assistance from other leaders, whether that be elders, or whether that just be competent people in your congregation. Yeah. And competent people, they are not necessarily mental health professionals, they can be. But y'all know people in your congregation that are just wise, thoughtful, that tend to be non-anxious people just because God wired them that way. Seek that person out, that person who's the ultimate non-anxious presence, who's calm. I had a coworker in Granbury. He served the church there as the adult education minister for 30 years. And one of the best coworkers I've ever had. But I always told people, you could race into Chris's office and say, Chris, the front part of the building just exploded. And he would say, okay, brother, what do you think we should do now? In that tone of voice. It aggravated me. But Chris is the kind of guy, I could go in his office and sit down and I could be, rattled about something. In about 5 minutes, my blood pressure would start coming down because he was just so calm. And when he did speak, his words were wise. He always had thoughtful things to say. Well, in this very calm tone, I think we ought to do this. And before I knew it, I was speaking more calmly because he was rubbing off on me. And everybody needs a Chris in their life. And now I can call him. He thinks I have a twisted sense of humor, which I do. And he enjoys my humor. I enjoy his calmness. So we complement each other. We've been friends for a long time now. Renew your commitment to be in the non-anxious presence I mentioned, and just as you go to the balcony, this is the time to pray. Maybe write your prayers. I have to write my prayers when I'm really excited and fixing to do something dumb and fixing to say something dumb. My dad used to tell me when I was a kid, get in a hurry and you make a mistake. So if you think that your kids aren't listening, they are. The two things that I stand out that I heard growing up was get in a hurry and you'll make a mistake. And my dad being of the generation he was, I always heard you'll be all right. That solved everything. You know, you hit your thumb with a hammer, you'll be all right. You know, I used to tell people I could have half my arm hanging off, you know, and bleeding. My dad say, oh, you'll be all right. With your little duct tape, you'll be all right. You know, so I thought, you know, that didn't hurt me any. But I did hear the get in a hurry and make a mistake. And I think that's true in crisis ministry. Slow down. Go to the balcony. Get that objective, panoramic view of everything that's going on, and you'll do a better job ministering to people as a consequence. Here's 5 is the ministry of presence. Isn't it true, and I put as Christians, and I would probably put in parentheses as preachers especially, as Christians, we often feel the pressure to exhort exclusively. We feel like, I need to say something profound. I need to quote some scripture. I need to preach to them. So, if the staff at Sunset asked me this afternoon to go to the ER at University Medical Center because there's been an unexpected death or there's been a horrible accident, somebody's hurt seriously, does that family want me to preach to them? No. I mean, I'm fully capable. I can do it from heart. Is that going to help them? Not in that setting. I mentioned I preached here at Sunset this past Sunday night, and I said, when there's a major event, and I've been on, I added up the other day, I've been over well over 125 death notifications with officers over the years. And I was just sharing a particular death notification I delivered where a man died of a heroin overdose, and we went to notify his mother. And I was talking about the very presence of God in such circumstances, and I said, you know, that's not the time for sermons. But I mentioned on Sunday night, but I said, but right now is. And we so preached on Psalm 139 and the reality of God's presence. So we feel obligated to have spiritually insightful comments or say something wise or particularly profound. And that's not necessary. I think we also feel compelled to bring immediate solutions. Have y'all ever wanted a magic wand? I've been on so many calls, I think, oh, if the Lord would give you a magic wand, I could solve this. You know, let me wave. I want to wave. I've always wanted a magic wand in my back pocket. And God has chosen in his infinite wisdom not to give us any magic wands. Or, on the other extreme, you don't know what to say. And so what do? You stay home. I don't know what to say. They've had this terrible event in their life. I don't know what to say. I feel uncomfortable. I think I'll just stay home. I just think I won't not go. Big mistake. Then we do nothing. And then that Brother Jones comes and says, my wife is seriously ill. Nobody reached out. And why did they reach out? Because they didn't know what to say and they felt uncomfortable. So, you know, after all these years, some of the calls I go on, I don't feel comfortable. You know, I responded to some suicides with the police department over the holidays. These are strangers. I don't feel comfortable, but I went anyhow and did my best to establish some rapport with people that were strangers. Think about Job's friends. They sat with him for 2 weeks and they saw how great his suffering was, so they didn't say anything. And what did they do when they opened their mouths? Read the whole book. Read the whole book. And I tell people, Job's not one of those books that you can lift out a few verses. You got to read it, all of it, and preferably at one setting. But Job's friends did fine until they opened their mouths. Mm-hmm. And then there's James 1:19. Quick to listen, slow to speak. Quick to listen, slow to speak. It works. There's value. and being quick to listen and slow to speak. So ministry of presence means doing and not asking. So here's what we're notorious about. Well, if there's anything I can do, call me. Call me if you need anything. Oh, keep us updated.
Yeah. Just gave him something else to do.
Exactly. Okay, so you just gave him something else to do. So what happens when a person is in crisis? What happens to their brain?
It's all scrambled.
It's all scrambled. It's mush. And they don't have the ability to process information. So I find if I'm on a call and I have to convey some really basic but significant information to a family, I generally have to say it 3 times. And it's not because they're not listening, it's because their brain is mush. So I have to tell them if there's been an unintended death, I have to tell them 3 times, your loved one is going to the medical examiner, and here in Lubbock, they're going to the medical examiner in Tarrant County in downtown Fort Worth. I've got to probably tell them that 3 times because their brain is mush. So they don't have the ability, especially to process information that's at all complex. It's hard to process even the most simple concepts. So for you to say, if there's anything I can do, you sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. It's just not computing in their brain at all. So there's an alternative. Instead, go mow the lawn. So I can tell a personal story on that note. My mother was in hospice care here in Lubbock for 3 months in 1991. I was a minister in Wichita Falls. I was the campus minister at Midwestern State at the time. And I burned out the highway between Lubbock and Wichita Falls. She was staying at my sister's home, who lives here. But I came in to help when I could. And several things that happened during that time period. One is I had a church member, if you're wondering what you can do, a person in crisis. This was a guy who was a retired Navy welder. As crusty and salty as any guy I have ever met. I mean, you're talking about rough around the edges. And he would come up to me after church in his gruff tone. How's your mom doing? Well, she's declining. He'd say, I'm very sorry. Here, you're going to need some gas money. And he'd put a $50 bill in my pocket. Now, in 1991, $50 went a ways for some gas. And he did that repeatedly. Every time I was actually in church on Sunday, Don would come up and he'd put a $50 bill in my pocket. That's ministering to somebody in crisis. How meaningful. My crusty, salty friend who had a heart of pure gold. So the other thing that happened, my mother was very, very particular about her yard. My mother was a Southern belle, and everything had to be proper. Proper is spelled P-R-O-P-A, not P-R-O-P-E-R. It's proper. And so every time I'd come to town, out of respect for my mother, I would go check her yard. Some mysterious person took care of that yard for 3 months. To this day, that was 1991, I have no inkling who that was. I don't know if it was a neighbor. I don't know if it was one of her friends. I don't know. But all I know is when I checked on it, it was manicured perfectly, flawlessly. Somebody knew my mother was doing it because they were. It just looked so nice. That's meaningful. And obviously, this person didn't feel compelled to draw any attention to themselves. They just didn't. Bring a gift card for a restaurant, or a Visa card, or a Walmart card, or whatever. Jason's Deli. Somewhere where you get sandwiches. Or Subway, whatever. But that's helpful to people. Or pay attention to what acts of service are needed. Just do it. The afternoon my mother passed away at my sister's house, we were exhausted. We had had enough. We were just exhausted. And I remember a friend of my sister's who worshiped here at Sunset at that time. I distinctly remember her cleaning up the kitchen and doing laundry that afternoon. And I don't remember that she had a whole lot to say. She just quietly went about and did the laundry and cleaned up the dishes. And we didn't hardly know she was there, but that's been 34 years now, and I still remember. And then let you just be creative. What can you do? What are you good at? That just quietly do it, and you don't have to necessarily ask the person. Go and just do it and get forgiveness later. The principle 6. value of silence. Can you sit with someone, hold their hand, and be silent? So one of the suicides I responded to here in Lubbock just a few weeks ago, this man's elderly lady, member of the church, I found out, when she found out that I was on staff here, that gave us some instant report. And I just sat on the couch next to her, I held her hand and listened to her and let her cry. And that way you put the pace of verbal communication in their court, not your court. So none of this chatter. And the content of conversation goes in their court. And you give them to process at their own pace. I just let her talk at the level. I've sat with people, we said nothing. Absolutely nothing. The one that stands out to me, I remember, this is probably 30 years ago, Wichita Falls. I responded to a fatality fire. And a little 10-year-old girl was perished in this fire. And the officer working the scene said, hey, the battalion chief of the fire department wants you to go back to the fire department with his guys. They were the first on this scene. They got here. By the time 911 was called, it was already too late. And these guys are just, they get in it to save lives. And it's very frustrating when they don't even have the opportunity to do what they're trained to do. So I remember going back in the middle of the night and sitting at the fire station, drinking coffee and just listening to these guys until shift change at 8 o'clock the next morning. And the battalion chief called me the next day and said, you did a great job. Thank you so much. And I remember thinking, I didn't do anything. I feel stupid. I feel inadequate. And then years later, it hit me. That's ministry of presence. They just wanted somebody to sit and be quiet with them, someone who's bringing a spiritual presence. And so they were able to process at their pace. And then the final principle 7, is deploy the volunteers. Okay, we talked about networking and we talked about a solo response is seldom a good response. I give credit to Beth Robinson, longtime psychology professor at LCU. I learned serve the A, serve the B, serve the C group from Dr. Robinson. So as you think about how am I going to respond, okay, you sit back and think that there's overwhelming needs, especially if it's an event that's really impacted the whole church. So who's the A group that you got to ask yourself? Probably the A group is going to be family. Okay, we're thinking in congregational settings, so probably that person's immediate family and also people at church who are really close to them. And that's probably not going to be a large group. And if you have been around the congregation for any length of time, you know who those people that are close to them. So that's your A group. And so you're going to provide a certain level of service to the A group. The B group might be their Bible class on Sunday morning, or their small group at church, or some other group that they're close to at church. That would be the B group. And then the C group would likely be the church as a whole, depending on the size of the congregation. Now, if you're a small congregation, everybody may be in the A group. I preached in Plains last Sunday. The whole church went out and ate Mexican food after church. It was so cool. I never experienced it. We're inviting the whole church, go to the restaurant. We're all sitting at one table. This is great. So that could be the case. But in your mind, and it's going to be unique to each situation you respond to, in your mind, who's the A group, who's the B group, who's the C group. And that's an important principle. I've used that a lot, and I stole that from Dr. Robinson unashamedly. So what if there's nothing else that you got out today, what does crisis ministry look like? And so if you don't remember anything else, you can remember the 3 H's. The 3 H's are hurry. No excuses, none of this, I don't know what to say. No excuses, hurry, go, and don't fool around. If it's an acute crisis, if there's been a death, there's a serious illness, or something else is going on, don't fool around, go and go now. Hug. You'd be surprised at people I've been hugged by over the years. I delivered a death notification some years back. A 19-year-old young man was killed in a crash in East Texas. And I went with 2 deputies to notify his parents. And his dad was this massive man. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall. He made me look like I was in first grade. I mean, he just towered me. He's a massive man wearing bib overalls. He's just kind of a good country guy. And that man in that setting hugged me, I thought he was going to break all my ribs. But here's this massive man that felt very safe and comfortable hugging me in that context. Now, probably in any other context, that may not have been the case, but he was so distraught, as you can imagine. But I need to feel real comfortable with that. And I needed at that point to feel comfortable being crushed by this massive man who was just, weeping and very distraught. And so hugging is very appropriate. And then the third one is hush. Quick to listen, slow to speak. Just be quiet. That doesn't look like. I'm going to tell a quick story. I promised I wouldn't do this. I've got time for one. I responded to a suicide 5 or 6 years ago out in the county for a family that lived in a very nice home on some acreage. And it was late October, so it's getting cool at night. And I pulled up and parked in front of the house. The firefighters that had responded as first responders were still there. This man had shot himself in front of his wife in the living room of their home. So you can imagine. So as I'm walking up to the porch where the man's wife is standing with a lady who I later found out was a friend of hers, the friend, I overheard the conversation between them. The friend was saying very loudly, this was kind of a boisterous, loud lady, and she said, well, it's just such a shame that Bubba wasn't saved and he's going to hell. I'm quoting that. That is an exact quote. I'm not missing a lick. And it went from there. It went downhill from there. So I'm thinking, y'all remember the old show, The Twilight Zone? I'm thinking, I'm in the Twilight Zone. I'm hallucinating. And there was a firefighter standing there, and I said, Tim, I called him by name, would you take the friend, would y'all take and go to another country or something? Canada possibly. I said, could you take? He knew exactly what I was trying to do. I said, I'd like to have some time with this gentleman's wife, just where I could speak with her. And so your ministry in that case is the ministry of separation. But that was a case where if she would just hush, I later met that lady. I went to a church camp. She was a nurse at a church camp I was at. And she said, oh, I remember you. I remember you too. But I think she was, despite her, when people are nervous, they say dumb things. Yeah. And so I don't mean to fault her at all, because all of us are fully capable of it. So that's why hushing is not such a bad idea. Quote from Henry Nouwen. We honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives mean the most to us. We often found ourselves, instead of giving advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our power system. That's a friend who cares. And I think that's a pretty good quote. Okay, now I can tell you a story about chocolate cake. We got just enough time. So Trooper Anderson, Thomas Anderson, he and his wife worshiped the congregation I served in Granbury. He called me one rainy Monday night, and we had a young woman who was killed in a crash between Granbury and Stephenville on Highway 377, which is a highway that's not built for the level of traffic that's on it right now. That area is growing so fast. And this young woman was killed, left a little 5-year-old girl. So he called me to the scene. He said, we need to make notification. He said, I've got an address for her and a driver's license, and I'm reasonably sure that the address is correct. That's why DPS wants you to change your address within 2 weeks of moving. That's one of the reasons. If we need to go find you, we want it to be right. But he said, I also have an emergency contact for her, and I'm thinking, I don't know, but I'm thinking it's her dad's address, and that the emergency contact is her father. He said, what do you want to do? I'm going to put it in your court. You want to go to her address? Or you want to go to dad's address? And I said, makes sense to me to go to dad's address. Let's do that first, and then we'll go from there. So we show up at dad's address, and sure enough, it is dad. He's there by himself, and Thomas and I went in and notified him what had happened to his daughter. He was, as you can well imagine, distraught. I believe she was late 20s, 26, actually is what I remember correctly. And what was striking to me is he was very alone. He and his wife are divorced. One of the other troopers went to see about notifying her. He didn't know his neighbors, didn't really have anybody who could call for him. Those are the saddest. And unfortunately, that's becoming, in 35 years, that's becoming the trend. You deliver a notification, and that's where I can tap into the church. I call people at church, would you come help me? Because I have somebody that has nobody. I've never been turned down by a church member to do that ever. In Granbury, my folks, they're saints. By the way, I'll just tell you, my folks in Granbury, they're saints. Because they would respond and help like that. I just need somebody to be a Christian for this person. Would you come be a Christian? Never got turned down, ever. So Thomas and I left that night, and neither one of us felt very good about leaving. We just felt unsettled. And he called me the next morning. Now, I wish I had a picture of Thomas. Thomas would give his grandmother a ticket. He just has the look on his face. He's a big, strapping guy, no nonsense. He's all business. And he called the next day and he said, hey, what can we do for this guy from last night? And after I got over my shock that he's calling asking this question, because that's just not really meant that way. And I said, looked to me like his whole house was pretty sparse. He lived in this little duplex. What if we went out to the grocery store, got him some lunch meat and some soft drinks and just some, it's always nice just to have, we could bring him something where he'd have something in the house to eat. He said, I like that idea. He said, and Autumn will bake a cake. That's Thomas's wife. And I said, I'm glad you volunteered Autumn to do that. So Autumn made a cake. And we went out there the next afternoon. We had all these. I went to Walmart. I went a little overboard. I just thought, hey, I'm going to do it right. And Thomas had this cake, and I had all these Walmart sacks. We knocked on this guy's door. At first, he didn't recognize us. And he said, y'all look different out of your uniforms. And, of course, he realized how that came across. And we all started laughing. And he invited us in. And I said, well, sir, we wanted to bring y'all some groceries. And Thomas's wife baked you a cake. And that man sat on his couch and wept because somebody cared. And I get emotional talking about it. It's been several years ago. I'll never forget that. But I think what's the great part of that story is, salty, crusty Thomas, the Spirit is living in that man's heart. He is a Christian, and he wants to do right. And despite being a hard-nosed trooper, he cares about people, and they all do, really. I volunteered for DPS as a chaplain for 19 years. And they're a privilege to work with. But they all look about like this picture, firm, steady, but they have hearts too. And so to do those kind of things is the essence of crisis ministry. So I've left exactly 3 minutes for questions. I apologize. I meant to leave more time to have questions. Real fast. What have I learned in 35 years? Number of people not support systems is going down. Chattering friends cause destruction. We referenced that. Consistency and good things happen in the church. No better to say.
So, how do you deal with when you're with the officers or the deputies on a day in, day out, and ministering to them? Because they see it so often.
They do. So, as a chaplain, our ministry was double-edged sword, doing the community work like delivering death notifications, but the core of the ministry was providing ministry on behalf of the officers and their families. I spent a lot of time down there, and so police officers are quick to trust, as you know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It took a couple of years, and this is one case where my gray hair helped me. Gray hair and experience, they valued experience. They couldn't care less if you have a degree in underwater basket weaving, but they value experience. And so we were able to ride along with them on shift anytime we wanted to. And I learned, if I'm going down there, if I wasn't ready to ride, I better not go down there because they'd rope you in. Oh, come out and ride with me. We'll just be out about an hour. They're lying. Yeah. They did every excuse. Oh, we're fixing to meet so-and-so to get a Coke over here at the convenience store. We'll just stay out another hour. You look up, you've been out with them 8 hours. Yeah. So, yeah, lots of ride-along opportunities. And, I've had lots of conversations. The amount of spiritual darkness they're exposed to is absolutely overwhelming. And it's not the dramatic stuff that you see on KCBD here in Lubbock. It's the day-to-day grind. It's the seeing children who are not being cared for well. It's seeing domestic violence. It's seeing things that you can't solve day in and day out. It's spiritual darkness. And I felt like what we did as chaplains, our intent was to shine light in a very dark environment. It's a really good question.
And so, do you have any books or lectures or something that you can recommend? Because this is something that is challenging. How to talk to people in distressing situations.
Very good.
A lot of times it doesn't come natural.
Yes. I'm trying to think of some of the best books. There are several books on crisis ministry. I might go like I could have a whole. I can actually give you a bibliography.
Okay.
Of good stuff. Yeah, there is good stuff out there. There's a book that for church members especially I think is good when helping hurts. That can be good because that addresses both sides of the spectrum, helping but also not over helping.
Mm-hmm.
Boundaries by Henry Cloud is excellent.
Read a book 3 or 4 years ago by, I think, a guy named Jimmy Hinson in Pennsylvania, The Devil Within. What do you do when the darkness, it was about his dad that abused every kid in the community in a Central PA Church of Christ. What do you do when the darkness is...
That would be a fantastic resource.
He's starting a ministry to do that, but for regular people like him, when the darkness is in your church, what do you do?
What do you do? Yeah, that's really good. There's far more of that than what you'd ever read.
What would be your advice for someone who's like younger and wanting to get into this field of work, especially like counseling, crisis ministry?
Right. I think there's outside a congregational setting, there's ample opportunity in most communities to volunteer, like volunteer at domestic crisis shelter, for example, or depending on age, you can volunteer for law enforcement agencies that do different things. But yeah, there's lots of nonprofits that are serving in different ways. Lubbock has got lots of opportunity to volunteer. Yeah, find your niche. I think every preacher should find their niche in the community to reach out. This has been my niche over the years, but that's to be everybody's niche. But every preacher should have a niche of outreach. The church in Granbury serves every first responder a home cooked meal every Tuesday at lunch.
Right.
They serve 80 to 85 people every single Tuesday, and it's amazing. They've done it for 10 years. Yes, sir.
I love what you said about listening. Active listening.
Active listening.
It's so important for us to support each other with love. It's just, she's teaching me that I gotta listen more, stop trying to fix everything. Because as a guy, I just want to fix the situation. So she'll tell me things, I'm like, trying to get solutions. But she's like, just
And especially, you can't fix things when a person's brain is mush. There's not much fixing can occur. Too much problem. Yes, sir.
Is mental illness incidence growing?
It's skyrocketing.
Well, why is that, do you think?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think breakdown of the nuclear family. That's my personal opinion. I think that social media is not helping any. Just to give you an example, I had 2 teen suicides back-to-back nights. I had a 17-year-old girl on Friday night and a 13-year-old girl on Saturday night.
Yeah.
Back-to-back nights. That was in 23.
A cell phone.
Yeah. So that's not, those are 2 big ones, breakdown of family. But like with the little 13-year-old girl, this girl could not have come from a nicer family. And that's why it was so heartbreaking. All of us that worked that call, I bet every one of those detectives who went home that night were just like me. We went home and cried.
Yeah.
How can you not? How can you reach out to a family who lost their 13-year-old and just not be overcome with emotion? Thanks. I know we have brown bag, not brown bag, we have brown bag down here. I'm thinking SIDI staff. We have brown or box lunches at the Family Life Center, I guess, if you have your ticket. And so thanks, y'all, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas.